Folks, we're going to move to World War II Part 3. The war in Europe is over. We're going to talk about the Pacific Theater and the end of World War II. It is very interesting. There were some big decisions had to be made. And our first subtopic will be War in the Pacific. Now it's kind of it. Go ahead.
I need a sheet.
Our first subtopic will be War in the Pacific, and I want to preface that by saying that if you were a soldier and you fought in the Pacific or you fought in Europe, it was totally a different world. I mean, it's a whole different world. And American troops that fought in Europe used to joke and kind of get half irritated about the easy life that the American soldiers had that were fighting in the Pacific because of the beach atmosphere, etc. So those American troops in Europe used to joke about and sometimes be upset about the easy life the American soldiers had if they were assigned to fight in the Pacific Theater. And that was probably true between battles. It was probably true between battles. But battles in the Pacific Theater of World War II were considered the most horrifying fights ever seen by man. There was more death, destruction, those types of things when they fought in the Pacific than there really was in Europe. So was the life easier over there between battles? Sure it was. You sat in the sun, got a suntan, enjoyed the beaches. But when they got into battle, it was much worse to be in the Pacific Theater than it would have been to be in Europe. And the reason is because of the attitude of the Japanese troops. They were taught by their commanders that loyalty to the emperor was the most important part of the war. They were also taught that they were never to surrender, that they would their responsibility was to die prior to surrender. So these people were very, very committed. They were instructed to fight to the final death and kill as many enemy as they could on their way down. And so it was a much different war in the Pacific. You were fighting an enemy that was very, very, very willing to die for their country. And everybody says that. And we'll talk about Vietnam later. And that became the first controversial war in which Americans were counting death and protests and that type of thing. But there's a big difference between a country that will fight to the death no matter what and those that have somewhat of a conscience. And the Japanese soldiers were instructed to fight to the final death and take as many as you can with you before you go. Now, what's probably the best example of the loyalty of the Japanese in this war? Anybody? Kamikaze pilots. Absolutely, kamikaze pilots. So that's probably the best example of the loyalty of the Japanese soldier to their country were the Japanese kamikaze pilots. Now, I don't know how many people know this, but in World War II, these kamikaze pilots were volunteers. They weren't told to go. They volunteered to go. They volunteered for the duty. And basically what they did is they filled their airplanes full of bombs and flew directly into American destroyers and aircraft carriers. That was their job. And they volunteered for that duty. They weren't picked. They volunteered. So basically they're willing to commit suicide in an effort to help their country hinder the Americans in the Pacific Theater. That's what they did. These kamikaze pilots filled their airplanes full of bombs and flew them on purpose directly into American destroyers and aircraft carriers. They're committing suicide for their country and willing to do it on a volunteer basis. I'm not sure you would see that in today's military. Anybody know where the word kamikaze came from or what it means? What's that? It means divine wind. Divine wind. That doesn't, you're thinking to yourself, what's that have to do with anything? I'll tell you. Divine wind. Now what happened is the Japanese, many years prior, were fighting in a country called Mongolia. Yes?
Are you saying win or win?
Wind. Divine wind.
Oh,
Divine wind. Kind of like Nolan. So the word kamikaze meant divine wind. And it referred to a previous war the Japanese had fought in Mongolia. Now what happened, there was a big Mongolian invasion force that was going to hit Japan. And it looked like if they did, Japan would be a goner. Well, all of a sudden a big storm, or in the Japanese mind, a divine wind came up during the war. It destroyed the Mongolian invasion force, winning the war for Japan. And so that's where the term came from, divine wind. It happened during a Japanese war with Mongolia. The Mongols were going to invade Japan. It looked like all would be lost if they were able to get there on their invasion force. All of a sudden a storm, or what they referred to as a divine wind, came up. It destroyed the Mongolian invasion force and won the war for the Japanese. That's where it came from. But the point of the subtopic in general is to let you know that war in the Pacific is going to be much different than the war in Europe. There's going to be a lot more casualties, those types of things. Now, that'll take us to our next subtopic then, which is strategy in the Pacific and early victories. Now, who's really leading the way in the Pacific of all the countries fighting? Who's leading the way? Who's supplying the most men, the most efforts? America, no question. So a lot of these terms are the American strategy. Well, this is the American strategy in the Pacific theater, consisted of a three-pronged attack of Japanese defense areas. Remember what the Japanese goal was? To secure as many islands as they could away from the homeland, get those islands secured. Then they were going to attack the Aleutian Islands, they were going to attack Hawaii, and then they were going to attack the Pacific coast of the United States. Well, the American strategy in the Pacific is going to be a three-pronged attack of those Japanese defense areas that they had already set up in the Pacific. Now, the American admiral that's going to be in charge of these attacks, in other words, he's going to direct this three-pronged attack, is going to be American Admiral Chester W. Nimitz. Chester W. Nimitz is going to be the American admiral who's in charge of this three-pronged attack of Japan's defense areas in the Pacific. He will be the overall commander of this strategy. American Admiral Chester W. Nimitz. And here's the three parts to it. Number one, air, land, and naval forces would strike westward, this is westward from America, at the Japanese-held islands in the Central Pacific. Air, land, and naval forces would strike westward at the Japanese-held islands in the Central Pacific. These Japanese-held islands in the Central Pacific are the ones that they have accumulated by virtue of their strategy to secure islands away from Japan. Well, the first prong of the three-pronged attack is we would send air, land, and naval forces and strike those Japanese-held islands to regain control of them. Okay? The second prong of the three-pronged attack is an American fleet under Admiral William F. Halsey would drive the Japanese completely out of the Solomon Islands. A fleet under American Admiral William F. Halsey would drive the Japanese completely out of the Solomon Islands. Those are islands that we need to take to make sure which country isn't overtaken by the Japanese. Australia, very good. Now, what did we lose? This is the third prong. What did we lose early in the Pacific in which an American general said, "I shall return"? What did we lose? Well, Corregidor's part of this. The Philippine Islands and New Guinea. Okay? And what the third part is General Douglas MacArthur would advance from Australia and capture New Guinea and then go on and recapture the Philippine Islands. So the third part of the three-pronged attack under the direction of Admiral Chester Nimitz is that General Douglas MacArthur would advance from Australia with troops. He would retake New Guinea and then on to the Philippine Islands to regain control there. Is that making sense? Now, let me ask you this question. Tristan, see if you know this. So once we did these three things and were successful in the air, land, and naval forces, taking all the Japanese-held islands, that we're going to drive the Japanese out of the Solomons. MacArthur's going to take New Guinea, and then he's going to come and retake the Philippines. What are we going to do next? Once we do all those things.
Try to sign the peace treaty, I guess?
Not exactly. Where are we going after we do these three things? Where are we going next, Josh? Which the Japanese do not want us to do. We're going to Japan. So the ultimate objective in these attacks would ultimately be a final assault on the mainland of Japan. That is a key thing to know, because we're going to get to that point. And Roosevelt is going to die, and Harry S. Truman's going to take over the presidency, and he's going to have to make a decision on whether he wants to do that. Does he want to attack the mainland of Japan? That will be Harry S. Truman's decision to make. That's key that you understand that. Okay, now, by the end of 1943, New Guinea had been recovered, and victory was won in the Solomon Islands. By the end of 1943, New Guinea would be recovered, and victories would be won in the Solomon Islands. Probably the most notable victory that was won in the Solomon Islands was at Guadalcanal. Yes, my dear?
Okay, how do you spell
The Guinea, N-E-W, obviously, right?
Yeah.
And then Guinea is G-U-I-N-E-A.
That's close.
So, that'll take us to our next subtopic, which is going to be American victory at Guadalcanal.
So,
It is not? You don't have Guadalcanal?
What about Koala?
wait.
Unbelievable. Did I forget that on there? That's okay, we'll get to it. So here is your,
Wait, I got a
What was the
question.
most
Yeah.
What about the Gibler Islands in Koala?
okay, don't worry about those yet, because we're not to that subtopic yet.
Okay.
What was the
subtopic we're in? I'm so confused.
But,
What was the most notable?
okay, listen, let's just go here. War in the Pacific is the first subtopic, is that correct?
Yes.
Strategy in the Pacific and early victories?
Yes.
Okay, here's your next one. I must have your sheet wrong, but we'll make it work. Yes.
What was the most notable?
I'm gonna tell you, Guadalcanal. But that'll be our next subtopic. I thought it was on your sheet. Next subtopic is American victory at Guadalcanal, and I'll spell it. So our next subtopic, which I don't have on that, I don't know what happened, American victory at Guadalcanal. Guadalcanal is spelled Guadalcanal. American victory at Guadalcanal, Guadalcanal. Now where's that island at? It's a part of the Solomon Islands. Very good. Now, the key about the battle at Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands, it was the first major offensive on the part of Americans in the Pacific Theater. We had basically been on the defensive up to that point. So we're kind of backing up, are we not? We talked about war in the Pacific early, and we went to Europe. Well, actually, are things still going on in Europe while we're talking about this stuff now? Yeah, because we haven't got to that point yet. So the Battle of Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands was the first major offensive on the part of the Americans in the Pacific Theater. It occurred in August of 1942, and the assault was led by the United States Marine Corps. The battle started in August of 1942. It involved the United States Marine Corps. What they did is they launched a surprise attack, and they took control of an air base at Guadalcanal that was under construction. So the Battle of Guadalcanal in Solomon Islands was the first major offensive on the part of Americans in the Pacific Theater, and the United States Marines launched a surprise attack in August of 1942 and took control of an air base under construction. Now, it's important. Every air base we take in the Pacific is important. This one was under construction, which meant when it was completed, who was going to use it to their advantage? The Japanese. So we took this air base over. Now, both sides suffered heavy losses at Guadalcanal. However, the Japanese suffered a far greater toll of casualties, and so they withdrew in February of 1943. So both sides suffered heavy losses in the victory at Guadalcanal. However, the Japanese suffered far greater toll of casualties, which forced them to withdraw from Guadalcanal by February of 1943. Now, it was a 6-month campaign. I mean, this didn't happen overnight. These battles aren't like 2 days long. This was a 6-month campaign. And it was very, very important that we took Guadalcanal, because what did we get there? A ton of air bases, those under construction and those there. Now, this battle was fought on the ground, it was fought at sea, it was fought in the air, but who was the key to the American victory at Guadalcanal? Which group? American U.S. Marines, no question. The resourcefulness of the United States Marines enabled the Americans to secure this important air base for the Allies. It was crucial to have that air base so there could be communication between the United States and Australia, and we were not going to be concerned about Australia taken by Japan. Very big victory at Guadalcanal. Now, here's something that you really need to know, and I know now why I don't have this down, because I put new material in. During the Battle of Guadalcanal, on November 13th of 1942, an American ship called the Uss Juneau was severely damaged in battle. So again, this was a 6-month campaign from August of 42 to February of 43. And during that time, on November 13th, 1942, an American ship called the USS Juneau was severely damaged in battle. What they did is they retreated, the ship retreated to try to get to port to get repaired. But en route to the port to get repaired, it was struck by a Japanese torpedo and sunk. Okay? So the USS Juneau was severely damaged in the Battle of Guadalcanal on November 13, 1942. They retreated, the ship and the crew retreated for repairs, and during their retreat, they were struck by a Japanese torpedo from a Japanese submarine, and it sunk. Inside the USS Juneau was a crew of 820 men, 115 of those who were immediately killed and fell to the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. So when that torpedo hit that boat, 115 of the 820 men on board were killed instantly and sank to the bottom of the Pacific. How many survivors does that leave? Just our math skills. 705. Where are those sailors? If they're not killed, where are they? They're in the water. And they are in the water for the next 8 days. So of the 705 soldiers that were left, they were in the water after the explosion for the next 8 days. You know how many of those 705 survived? Of 705 in the water for 8 days, how many survived? 10.
Oh.
10 survived.
That's crazy.
What'd they die of? Dehydration, exposure in the waters. But like Macklin said, many died from shark attacks. Many died from shark attacks. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine being in the water? Not only are you dehydrated because you haven't any water, you can't drink the salt water. You're exposed, it's cold, and you're fighting off sharks who are just feasting on a free meal. 10 of 705 survived. 10. Here are among the casualties. I'm going to give you 5 examples of casualties of the lives that were lost on the USS Juneau. First example is George Sullivan. He was 27 years old. George Sullivan. So you know there's going to be a story, don't you? Sullivan. S-U-L-L-I-V-A-N. George Sullivan died. He was 27. Frank Sullivan died. He was 26. Frank Sullivan died. He was 26. Joe Sullivan died. He was 24. Matt Sullivan died. He was 23. Al Sullivan died. He was 20.
Wait, who?
Al Sullivan. He was
Al,
20.
like A-L.
How old was the first one?
George was 27, Frank was 26, Joe was 24, Matt was 23, and Al was 20. Thomas and Alina Sullivan lost all 5 sons on that fateful day of November 13th, 1942. Lost all 5 of their sons. Some of you come from big families. I saw a beautiful picture of the Wassam family on Facebook. I'm not a big Facebook guy. Beautiful picture of all the kids. And I'm thinking to myself as I'm preparing for this lecture, how would the Wassam family feel if all 5 of those kids went to serve and all were killed in the same war, same battle? I mean, it would wipe you out. Now, the reason they were all together is because they insisted on not being separated during the war. They wanted to serve together. So they placed all 5 brothers on the USS Juneau. Placed all 5 brothers, all 5 killed. How would you like that message? How would you like the military coming to your house and saying, gee whiz, you lost, I'm sorry to report, Mr. and Mrs. Sullivan, but you lost your son George. And by the way, you lost your son Frank. And you lost your son Joe and Matt and Al. All on the same